Hello, I'm Andrew Tsao. In this episode of Backstory, we're going to see a trailer for 100% Off, a Recession-era romance. A story about two young couples coming to the end of their undergraduate year at the University of Washington. The film documents the journey they take while trying to figure out what their future will hold during economic uncertainty. And with us today is the filmmaker, Shaun Scott. Shaun, thanks for being here on Backstory.
Thanks for having me.
Great to have you here. We met actually originally after you had just screened the film for the first, well, not the first time, but you held a local screening and we had a chance to hang out. And so what I'd like to do is sort of share with our audience your journey as a filmmaker, because what's interesting is you actually began as a documentary filmmaker and with this film moved into narrative. So take us through a little bit of your background.
Well, I was born November 8th, 1984, and the first residence that I remember living in was the Lefrak City housing projects in Queens, New York. And so growing up there, well, I shouldn't say growing up there, spending the first years of my youth there in the 80s, I was always very aware of circumstance and how circumstance made certain people as individuals and as groups behave in ways that you can discern. So the television was always on in my household, sort of vis-a-vis my father, my mother as well. And I mark a lot of my development as a filmmaker from those early years and seeing historical events played out on the television. Presidential elections, one in 1988, another one in 1992. In between events like the Rodney King riots, the O.J. Simpson media circus, the Million Man March later on in 1995. All of those events are some of the first memories that I have individually, and it's very difficult for me to separate those out from who I am personally.
It's interesting because you're talking about a specific era where I guess what we consider the norm today was just emerging, which was the idea of the 24-hour news cycle.
That's right.
So coming into your home now, we're not just little bits and bytes, but sort of these epic stories unfolding with nonstop coverage, and those are some of the events you're talking about.
Exactly. So, I mean, a news program or a news station like CNN, which basically got its start after the Iran-Contra crisis, that was sort of the beginning of an era that sort of, I think, marks a lot of where many other young filmmakers, and probably a lot of other young people in particular, sort of had their awareness and their mind's eye shaped. Just as you said, in this idea that events can get covered and we don't have to stop covering them. And after you cut to commercial from some of these events, you know, the dish soap that you will buy is intimately bound up in these hostages that are getting off of the plane. And then you cut to commercial again, and you're supposed to be going to this restaurant where you'll have these great family. So all of these sort of events, and I should say some of the mistakes slipped in there as well. I think those are the things that sort of informed my consciousness as a filmmaker from the very, very early stages. And it was later on into my teen years, going to college, maybe even earlier than that in high school as well, getting sort of my start piecing together old video footage that I had taped off the VHS. So I'd always had an idea of myself as somebody who had a bent towards assemblage, putting things together that existed out there, but it was more or less my role to sort of combine, take in, and recreate and represent all these sort of media parcels that were out there.
So you were there sort of recording stuff on the television and then recomposing them as stories, as documents of time periods and events. What began to shape your sense of what would make a piece of film a film itself beyond just sort of, you know, the events of the day? What were you thinking in terms of, gee, I want to pull this stuff together and you know, make A plus B equal more than just C, but more than the sum total of its parts?
Right. I look back as a formative event when I was 15 years old. Ken Burns' Jazz was on PBS, and it was, you know, epic 10-hour series. You watch it across 3 weeks or however long it was, and that was sort of the first time that I had seen another filmmaker, or a filmmaker I should say, take archival footage but then stick it next to new interviews and original footage that was shot as well. And so that was, I think I marked that as really the first sort of awakening that I had as to the potential and some of the things that you can do as far as combining past and present
right.
to create an experience, more or less.
Yeah, Yeah. So a lot of the way you saw media and cinema as a tool was as a way to open up history or open up current events. But now with 100% off, you as a filmmaker move into, we'll say, fictional narrative, for lack of a better word, because it's actually a wonderful hybrid and combination of both. Tell us a little bit about that transition for you. What was it that made you sort of say, okay, you know, I want to lean a little heavier on character relationship and the story I create in conjunction with sort of the reality of the time?
It was a natural leap for me, a natural creative leap, having made a couple of documentaries in 2009 and also in 2010.
Okay.
The first one, called Seat of Empire, was sort of a biography history of Seattle.
Okay.
So more or less making a character out of this impersonal entity that contained a lot of personal stories.
Yeah.
The one after that was a film called Waste of Time that sort of took, well, if you can have that sort of historical biographical approach for a city, can you do the same thing for the country and American consumer culture as a whole?
Try to turn it into a character itself.
Right.
And explore the facets of it.
Exactly, and show that just as you look at it in the course of an individual life, there are moods and turning points and historical moments, turning points where you might not turn, or you turn the wrong way, or you turn in an unexpected direction. It was a sense that I had, and I can't say exactly when the precise moment that this happened was, but over the years, the cumulative effect was sort of having the ability to look at things that we tend to think of as impersonal as actually taking on sort of the ebbs and flows and rhythms of an individual life. So having known that and having seen that and having that been a part of my own sort of creative nervous system, I think, and having done that for 2 films, 100% Off was really more of an attempt to sort of say, well, can you do that with a country at the same time that you can do that with individuals?
And so you ultimately come up with a story of people who are at a point in their lives where the events in the world around them, as you say, are profoundly impactful. I mean, every decision they make really has to do with this sense of the recession that the film focuses on, and the fact that their future's in jeopardy. So as you are working on this piece, given what you just told us about how you view the project and how you came to the narrative, how did you approach writing this script? Did you first conceive of the, if you will, the container of the recession and think, I need the characters to live that, or did the characters come to mind? I mean, how do you structure something like this before you make it?
100% Off, I would say, was a project that was deeply ingrained in my personal biography, and in the biographies of people who were close to me and still close to me at the time, close to me now and close to me at the time that the film was being made. Excuse me. So I knew that on the individual level, and also part of that might have been just the way the story came out. Might have been just the fact that I had a certain disposition towards looking at things with a historical lens.
Right.
There's a moment, for example, in 100% Off, where we see a character writing a bus, taking a very banal bus ride.
Yeah.
But that bus ride then becomes sort of an opportunity to explore some of the anxieties that she has about her own future. And she does that by looking back on the past.
Yes.
And those are sort of, as I said before, moments that, having made documentaries before, they were very natural creative moves for me to make.
Yeah, I mean, the film that our audience is going to see now has an absolutely unique structure to it, and I think that is one of the things that makes it resonate so well. I was just thinking about sort of the boldness of, you know, some of Godard's films, where he would mix current political things going on in his world at the time, and he would combine them with fictional elements and sort of make a sort of, you know, a genre unto itself.
Right.
You know, you can't really just call it drama. You can't call it documentary. It's really its own sort of personality. So before we take a look at the film, I just want to say I have a personal connection because a couple of the actors that are starring in it were former acting students of mine.
Right.
And just real quick, tell us what it was like working with them.
It was great. We've talked about this a little bit before, sort of the idea that one of the things that you're doing when you're making films, and actually there's a sense in which the only thing that you're doing when making films is projecting relationships that you're building.
Yeah.
And sometimes you have to come up with those relationships on the fly.
Yeah.
Other times, as in the case of working with the actress Lori Roberts, who plays the lead Rose, and also our producer Andrew Schwartz, who was very instrumental in getting the film made from behind the camera. Those are relationships that you're able to fall back on because you have they were similar upbringing, similar disposition. There's a lot that you can then draw on, so that when you're going to, shoot a scene about two guys just having a drink at Flowers,
everyone's connected
that's
to
an
that
experience
reality
that everybody has already had.
You're living the current event itself.
Exactly.
Great. Now here's a look at the trailer for 100% Off, a Recession-era romance.
Now, they say you can tell who the tourists are in Seattle because they're the ones with the umbrellas. And if you live in an area with as many tourists as we've got, it gets hard to hold on to history. Everyone's from somewhere else. But we've got something better than history, or I should say, something that's always gone right alongside it in the West. Nature, land, space. The prospect of property. It's the one constant, even if the faces change.
To be honest, I'm tired of talking about my relationship, especially with you, Scott. But I guess you're just like everybody else. For some reason, our relationship was like a movie that everybody thought they could make, with a camera and a couple $100 to blow on film.
So this film we just saw combines a copious amount of archival material, a lot of material that you went out, wrote, shot, directed, edited, and there's some wonderful sort of information and news about the time, the recession that takes place in. Take us into the editing room now, once you've assembled all this stuff, and talk to us a little bit about how you found the shape, ultimately, of the film we just saw.
I think editing for me is the last third of sort of a three-part identity, I guess, that I have as a filmmaker. And it starts with writing as the first phase. The second phase would be directing, actually being on set, collecting the footage, having sort of images in your creative subconscious that are then going to come out in ways that you can't really anticipate, but can control for. And the third part of it would be editing. So many of the things that we see as far as the cutaways and cutbacks, these instances where we sort of transition on a dime from the present to the past, many of those, believe it or not, were actually already written in.
Okay.
So it came down to being in the editing room. It was really just following sort of the guideposts that we had there and using the screenplay more or less as a manual to sort of navigate sort of these temporal boundaries, which are ultimately disrespected.
Yeah. Now, give me an example of where that didn't happen, where because of because of the experience of the shoot itself, you come back and you say, "Hey, this is a whole nother street I can go down."
That's a really good question. We made the decision to shoot on 16 millimeter, and that was a decision that was made in pre-production. Shooting with 16 millimeter has, as many of our viewers probably know, a lot of hazards unto its own that people have decided to really turn their backs on.
Yeah.
So what I'm getting at is that we had a lot of scenes that we ended up shooting that would turn out not quite as expected, or not turn out at all, or maybe turn out better. So for some of the ones, for example, there's a moment where we go into sort of a montage about a montage demonstrating sort of the construction of houses.
Yes.
And showing step by step, piece by piece, how many of these suburbs that we sort of idealize and put on a historical platform, how those came together. That was definitely supposed to have been there. But then there's a later scene where we see sort of a reverse shot sequence where the character Shaun is watching the TV. Originally, what was written into the script was him watching Barack Obama on television, but I had instead, and this is one of the editing room mistakes that you're interested in, sort of discovered an old archival footage about some people in such a suburb, I think it was Levittown, Pennsylvania, made the decision that they didn't want to have residents of color. And I thought that was, not only was it much more apropos for sort of the trajectory of the story, but it also said something about the time that we were living in presently, and said something about the character's expectations. What could he expect out of life as somebody who was a college student? And what sort of sense of himself does he have as somebody belonging to this historical moment, who came from a background or came from a time where there were opportunities that were even more constricted than they were for him now. So in that sense, the screenplay was definitely deliberate in providing a lot of these opportunities, but the editing room became a little bit more of a sort of a petri dish to push things to an extreme, even more so.
The idea of making this film, which, as we said at the top, and I think it's very evident now looking at it, of making a film that you're very aware defies genre, which again is one of the things that fascinate me about it, and your point of view as a filmmaker. I love this sort of style you're exploring right now. Is it a plus or a minus as an independent filmmaker? I guess I'm trying to move us into a conversation sort of about the place of the independent filmmaker today in terms of their voice and, you know, the level of ownership one takes of the material and the sort of, you know, more realistic restrictions of the marketplace. Is that something that you factor into your work or not?
Those are things that you have to be, as a matter of profession, aware of. But you also have to be aware of the fact that you're contributing to this tributary that's been flowing for a century or more at this point. And not only is it a time thing, but it's also a matter of space. some filmmakers in this community have a skill that lends itself much more to a performative aspect. And you look at their films and you feel like you've watched a play in a sense.
Yeah.
Others have strengths that lie in being able to thrill you. Some can make you laugh. I see myself more than the commercial self-awareness. I think the matter of stylistic and professional self-awareness is for me to recognize that there are many voices, and that the way that you can help those voices come to the forefront even more is by speaking yours without reservation.
It's fascinating. You know, recently a new book on Godard's films was released, and the title of it is Everything is Cinema. And I like that, and I bring it up because what you're really talking about is this notion that perhaps our boundaries of what we consider the motion picture have been so impacted by the commercial mainstream that we forget the potentiality of putting an archival piece of film next to a character, next to a graphic, next to a voiceover about economics, and thereby creating sort of a deeper awareness of the power of cinema. And I think that's really, really refreshing. Would you count him as an influence? Talk for a second about who you admire in that world.
I think it's impossible to belong to this historical moment and to be a filmmaker in the 21st century and not go back and look at members of the French New Wave as filmmakers who definitely push certain boundaries.
Yeah.
Excuse me. I think more than Godard, although he certainly was a big influence for me, I look back on a film, Hiroshima Mon Amour.
Yes, René.
That René had made.
Yeah.
And I think that one had much more of a hold as far as shaping and encouraging me to move in the direction of cultivating a historical imagination.
Which is interesting because his obsession, a little bit different than Godard's, had so much to do with the juxtaposition of events in time.
Exactly.
I mean, and also the displacement of characters. You know, in that film, particularly dealing with an interracial relationship and two cultures, French and Japanese, that are trying to find their way in between. So that's great to hear about some of those influences. Let's before we wrap up, you know, you're going to stay here and continue to make film in Seattle.
Definitely.
Talk to me about your take on the Seattle film community. I love doing this show because I feel like, in a way, it is not just a platform and a voice, but it's a specific kind of feedback in that we're increasing awareness of it. But it's best always to hear from the filmmakers themselves. What's going on out there? What's your sense of the pulse of things?
I think that that's a very multifaceted question. The first thing that I think about is the fact that the question of remaining or leaving is at the forefront for a lot of filmmakers in a way that it might not be for many other film scenes.
Oh yeah.
And that one of the reasons for that could be that we're still getting to a stage where we're developing an infrastructure that can keep
that can
filmmakers
sustain
sort of in
the
place.
business itself of making a film.
Right. And the single best attribute that I think the film scene has is the ability of filmmakers to make films that are not being, of a sort that are not being made for various reasons in other parts of the country.
Well, I would think that'd be part of what our identity should be. I mean, we're all about that kind of innovation, and it have always been artistically. And as a matter of fact, I mean, you know, the great independent alternative to Netflix, IndieFlix, is based out of Seattle.
Right.
So it all makes sense
Right.
that way. So tell us just what we can look for you next.
Oh, sure. I'm actually, in a matter of weeks, we're heading into production for my fourth film, my second narrative feature. It's called Pacific Aggression, about a travel writer who travels to Seattle to try to save his girlfriend from her addiction to social networking, as it were.
Sounds like it's about people trying to make connections in a technological world.
Definitely.
In a new way,
You
in
know
a real
that.
way.
Right.
Great. It's a pleasure having you here, Shaun.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely wonderful. We'll have you back again.
All right.
And I'd like to thank you for watching Backstory. I'm Andrew Tsao, and I will see you again behind the scenes.